By the early 1950s, Soviet research centers had come to the conclusion that development of a practical air-to-air missile was now feasible. Militarily, this was obviously desirable given the rapid development of US and British jet-powered strategic bombers. Semyon Lavochkin was the first OKB director to pursue the idea of a fully integrated weapons system consisting of a high-performance aircraft, a radar and a missile, held together by a computerized fire control system. He teamed up with Viktor Tikhomirov, the director of NII-17, a Ministry of Aircraft Production R&D center tasked with radar and electronics development, to propose this pioneering weapons system in 1953. On the 20th of November, the Politburo itself gave the two men permission to proceed. Their instructions called for an integrated system called K-15, consisting of 4 components. The interceptor itself was codenamed I-250. Its missiles were I-275. They were to have 15-kilometer range and be operable in all weather conditions. These 2 components were the responsibility of Lavochkin. The missiles would be a particular challenge as Lavochkin had no experience in their development. The radar component was designated K-15U because of the 15-kilometer range requirement. This was NII-17's responsibility. And finally, a new set of GCI equipment was to be developed to allow the system to function within the Soviet air defense infrastructure. In totality, the effort would require the participation of 15 different Soviet state agencies, including 6 aircraft design bureaus. These would all be coordinated by Lavochkin. The chances of politics were thus remarkably high, before the technical complexity of what was being attempted was considered as a potential reason for failure. An added complication, in case more were needed, was the pace at which the Politburo and thus MAP wanted to move. They were hoping to have the aircraft ready for service well before the end of the decade. Fortunately, Lavochkin did have a useful starting point in the prototype I-200 heavy fighter, which had also been radar-equipped. Development of the 200 had begun in January 1948, and it concluded on a relatively conventional aircraft with a thick, 40-degree swept wing powered by 2 Klimov VK-1 centrifugal turbojets. The crew sat side by side in a broad fuselage. The engine placement was somewhat unusual, in that they were mounted in tandem but fed by a single nose intake. The air ducting was split 3 ways, with the centre channel dropping down to feed the front engine, and the side 2 curling around the cockpit to feed the rear engine. A Tori A radar set was mounted in the centre of the intake. It was also a product of the NII-17 Research and Development Bureau. Although it has that characteristic fat cylinder look of contemporary Soviet aircraft, it was actually pretty big. All up, this version of the 200 weighed 22,870 pounds for takeoff, and it was capable of just about clearing Mach 1 in a dive. Span was 43 feet and 6 inches, and the fuselage was just over 54 feet long. It was therefore about 80% heavier than a MiG-15 and 30% greater in wingspan. It was 60% longer. 2 LA-200 prototypes were built, and they completed state trials in May 1951, although the Tori radar proved unreliable. Incidentally, the 2 prototypes have quite different configurations. The first, which had no radar, had the initial large central radome. The second version had the radar moved to a Saberdog-style installation on the upper intake lip. This configuration shows just how small the Tori's dish was and thus how limited its range was likely to be. Even so, having completed the trials, by rights the 200 should therefore have been selected for mass production, but it was not. Part of this was dawdling by the MAP, who seemed to have thought there might be something unspecified but better out there. They issued an updated specification that required greater range, speed, and radar performance. Lavochkin therefore went back to the drawing board and created an updated fighter called the I-200B. This was a pretty unattractive aircraft that returned to a more fared-in nose containing a more advanced RP-6 Sokol radar. Intakes were now beneath the nose, with 2 more on the upper sides. 200B was about £3,000 heavier than the 200, but it shared similar dimensions. It flew without the radar on the 3rd of July 1952, and then with it on the 10th of September. Over 100 flights were completed in the test program, but it was eventually terminated in November 1953, and Lavochkin was ordered to give the precious Sokol radar to Yakovlev for his and their use. Lavochkin's first design sketches for the LA-250 in 1953 therefore look much like the LA-200. Its fuselage was long and thin, flanked by two AL-7 turbojets in flush nacelles. The cockpit was side by side. At this stage, the whole package weighed 46,000 pounds, of which 1,650 was the radar. It was supposed to be able to hit 1,000 miles an hour and climb to 53,000 feet. The initial climb to 40,000 feet was supposed to take just 2.5 minutes. Cruising speed was supposed to be 620 miles an hour and endurance 2.5 to 3 hours. That's a combat radius of about 1,000 miles. It must be remembered that these were the days of highly ambitious on-paper performance specifications on both sides of the Iron Curtain. A major reason for this was the overconfidence of engine designers, and that was the same with the 250. In this case it was Lulka, and they had yet to actually build an AL-7 at all. When K-15 got underway for real, Lavochkin decided to switch from the proposed AL-7 to a new Klimov turbojet called VK-9. On paper this was a beast. It gave 18,750 pounds of force dry and 26,500 in afterburner. Reality so often disappoints. The for real LA-250 was designed around two of these large motors. By the summer of 1954, the 250's design was more or less complete. It was very different from the slightly dumpy initial sketches and had become a long, rangy needle carrying a pair of missiles in under-fuselage recesses. Its long nose concealed the large K-15U radar. Aft of the nose, the crew now sat in tandem ejector seats developed by the Alexeyev OKB under a single hinged canopy. Elliptical intakes with prominent fixed shock cones were mounted below the cockpit, and the wing was now a mid-mounted delta, flanking the fuel tanks contained in the centre fuselage section. Engines are at the rear, having moved from the nacelles. The 250 was one of the first Soviet aircraft to move from nose to lateral intakes, and thus little was known about their aerodynamics. Those shock cones looked great but would prove somewhat on the draggy side. All in all, it's a genuinely lovely aircraft to look at. Weight had, however, unfortunately grown rather a lot in the process. Empty, it was now a 37,000-pound aircraft, with normal takeoff weight at 60,650 pounds, which could go up to 70,100 pounds with drop tanks. Performance was essentially the same as before. MAP were happy, and a wooden mock-up was therefore ordered to do the detailed work of fitting the myriad systems into the airframe. One of the most pressing items to fit was the K-15U radar, which was both large and needed to be installed in such a way as to prevent interference from and to other aircraft components, as well as to give it the best possible performance. Development of the I-275 missiles was also proceeding at pace. Their design changed multiple times during 1954, finally zeroing in on a large 8.5-inch caliber, 19-foot 8-inch long body, powered by an Isaev-designed liquid-fueled motor. It could carry a 275-pound warhead out to about 12 miles at 2,500 miles per hour. It was not only the engine designers who were tripping out in 1954. Weighing 1,980 pounds, it had a lethal radius of more than 150 feet. The tricky bit would, of course, be getting it within 150 feet. Common with other larger OKBs, Lavochkin had their own prototype engineering plant. Work on the first 250 began there in early 1955. The first of a series of highly predictable setbacks then struck when the Klimov VK-9 proved to be impossible to actually engineer and was thus cancelled. Unfortunately, the VK-9 had very distinctive dimensions, and there wasn't another engine in the Soviet inventory that would fit into the 250's engine bay. Lavochkin was thus forced to return to Loika for the AL-7F1 motors. These offered real, rather than fantasy performance, providing 16,535 pounds of force dry and a still impressive 22,045 pounds in afterburner. But the AL-7F1 was a totally different engine to the VK9, and the 250 thus needed a redesign, emerging a somewhat smaller and lighter aircraft as a result. Known as 250A, the redesign saw the tandem recess mountings for the I-275 missiles being deleted for conventional pylon mounts, reducing complexity and airframe length. Moving to pylons also meant that other missiles could be carried, including the then proposed I-277 and nuclear-tipped I-279. Reducing length also usefully reduced fuel capacity, with a positive effect on normal takeoff weight, but obviously a negative one on range. A centerline pylon plumbed for fuel and rated to carry a big 1,350-litre tank was added. Since NII-17 were continuing to develop the radar, an upgraded K-15M was now included in the nose. All of the work fitting its numerous boxes into the old wooden mock-up had to be binned and the process repeated on the new, smaller airframe. The 250A design was completed in October 1955 and approved in early 1956. Realism had begun to set in, and although the aircraft's dynamic characteristics were expected to be basically the same as before, the requirement for a 15-kilometre engagement range had been dropped down to between 9 and 12. The K-15 missile also changed quite markedly in parallel to the redesign. It was now a svelte 1,760-pound weapon called the 275A. Interestingly, the bones of the first 250 prototype were actually completed, with substantial alterations as a flying stability and handling testbed. The engines were AL-7Fs with about 15,200 pounds of force dry and 20,000 in afterburner. Just to remind you, that's the engine in the Su-7 and the Su-9, and it was a powerful motor when it worked, which it's fair to say wasn't always. The aircraft was completed on the 16th of June 1956, and it was trucked to a flight test centre at Zhukovsky, just south of Moscow, for trials. It was here that the long, powerful-looking fighter received its nom de guerre. The engineers at the test centre dubbed it the ANAKONDA. Ground testing and high-speed taxi runs went well, so on the 16th of July the engineering team felt that they were ready to take off for the first time. Its pilot would be the vastly experienced A.G. Kochetkov. He had at that time flown 96 different aircraft types, including numerous US models, during a spell testing out Lend-Lease products in the US during 1944. This would be amongst his shortest flights, adding mere moments to his 2,375 flying hours. N.P. Zakharov was in the back seat. Observer is the right term for him in this instance. The Anaconda accelerated smoothly and lifted off. It then demonstrated that looks don't make the plane. 2 seconds after the wheels lifted, the 250 rolled 5 degrees to starboard and then started pitching and rolling further to starboard. After wrestling with the Anaconda for a second, Kochetkov decided that he needed to try and put it back down again. Because of the roll, the starboard main gear touched down hard and the 250 bounced back into the air, now trailing fire for added dramatic effect, and landing 800 metres further down the runway. This time it stayed down, but it was now running along the part-paved shoulder of the runway with the nose high. With impressive clarity of thought, Kochetkov deployed the braking parachute, but without noticeable effect. A kilometre further on, he ran out of runway. The Anaconda smashed through the perimeter fence and into a sand trap. The landing gear collapsed and the 250's maiden flight came to an end in a ball of dust and smoke. Miraculously, Kochetkov was only slightly bruised by the ordeal. Zakharov was completely unscathed. But the ordeal wasn't quite over yet. They made a rapid escape from the cockpit, Kochetkov pulling the extinguisher handle on the way out and thus saving some of the 250. It was a startlingly good bit of flying and a very brave act. That said, the Alexeyev ejection seat wasn't rated for low altitude and low speed escapes, so perhaps there was some clear thinking involved there as well. The problem was a particularly dumb one. Rather than make proper calculations about the necessary control forces required for the 250, the engineers had simply scaled up some prior forces used for the MiG-19 and Yak-25. This led to the control responses being very delayed and thus out of phase with the inputs being made by the pilot. Furthermore, the artificial field system wasn't powerful enough, and therefore Kochetkov couldn't sense what was going on. This combination of errors led to an uncontrollable aircraft, resulting in the oscillations and the crash. In the spring of 1957, a second prototype was completed. It was the first 250A and was actually built at the Kubyshev factory that made MiG-17s rather than at Lavochkin. It was broken down and transported to the test centre on a railcar. The tail was very tall and it couldn't be removed, so many overhead power lines for trams and trolleybuses had to be removed along its route. Many curses were doubtless directed at aircraft designers by their comrades in railway engineering. The route went through downtown Moscow, so many more people had to pretend not to notice the large aircraft-shaped thing under a tarpaulin moving past them. A security task force accompanied the convoy, helping those who did notice choose to forget about the locomotive wheels and parts they had seen being moved. Although laborious, the mode of transport actually turned out to be fortunate because it turned out that some of the bolts used in the aircraft were of an excessively brittle grade of steel. They snapped in transit and had to be replaced before they could cause another easily avoidable accident. By the 12th of July 1957, the ANAKONDA had been reassembled and it was time to attempt a flight longer than 5 seconds. Kochetkov was at the controls once again. The engines were still base model AL-7Fs, and since there was no radar, it was mercifully decided not to risk a second life in the back seat. This time, however, things went just fine. Although rather underpowered, the 250A flew well. Unfortunately, things didn't go well for long. On the 6th test flight, on November the 28th, Kochetkov undershot the runway due to low cloud and poor visibility over the Anaconda's long nose. Landing on the sandy runway perimeter tore the landing gear off. The 250A slid along the concrete on its belly, trailing sparks. Once again, it caught fire. This time the canopy jammed and Kochetkov was forced to physically smash his way out and clamber to safety. Thus ended the second prototype. Lavochkin immediately made a design change, implementing a 6-degree droop on the nose forward of the cockpit to increase visibility. The landing gear was also strengthened and some other unrelated changes were also made in areas like the intake positioning. This aircraft arrived in Moscow in January 1958 and it was ready for flight testing on the 30th of July. It was even more underpowered than the first aircraft as its AL-7Fs lacked afterburners due to unavailability of parts. Sukhoi was monopolizing Loika's production, which was probably quite convenient for them as they began to contemplate the Su-11. While all this was going on, 50 275A missiles had been made, and they were delivered to the test centre, which meant that carriage and separation testing could start. But unfortunately, the lack of afterburners meant that the 250 was restricted to subsonic speeds, and it couldn't climb much past 40,000 feet. Since the prototype also lacked radar, it was impossible to do the required weapons testing. They did make some ground launches, starting in April of 1958, though. 10 of the trial batch were also converted to use a solid fuel motor. The second prototype then suffered its own mishap, another landing gear collapse that was repairable but put it out of action. The Anaconda's landing gear was a constant source of trouble due to the aircraft's large weight for the time. Since there were no tyres large or strong enough, tyres had to be handmade rather than machine-moulded. They were slicks and they had a very short lifespan. Cracks appeared in them after only a few uses and they had to be replaced. With the K-15M radar still unavailable, Lavochkin started preparing an alternative option to fit the Sokol radar that would ultimately be used in the Su-15. This was a shorter-ranged set and it required development of the 279 and 280 missiles to use with it. But perhaps stirred into action, NII-17 finally delivered a K-15M radar ready for installation on the third prototype 250A. It was an upgraded variation of the K-15U, development of which apparently continued in parallel for some reason. Although the updated engines were still not ready, progress had been made on the 275 missile based on the ground launches. 275A had been put on a diet, now weighing 1,320 pounds. To give you a sense, that's 28% heavier than an R-40R Acrid, as carried by the MiG-25. It was still on an 8.5-inch caliber, although the length was smaller by a foot at 18 feet 8 inches. The warhead was up to 310 pounds from the meagre 275 pounds of the original. It was a beam rider, with all of the problems that brought, but it was, however, extravagantly powerful. Its liquid propellant rocket motor burned for more than 20 seconds and can apparently accelerate the big missile to Mach 3.4. So finally, in May 1958, all of the components were ready to test the K-15 system. Since Aircraft 4 had a metal nose, no radar, and was outfitted with cameras to record control system response, it fell to Aircraft 3 to perform the trial interceptions. Unfortunately, the ANAKONDA just wasn't up to the task. Even with afterburners, it was too slow. Top speed was only 670 miles an hour rather than 1,000. The crucial climb to 40,000 feet took nearly 6 minutes rather than 2.5. After 5 years of frustrations, Lavochkin was ready to call it a day. Part of his willingness to give up was his fascination with guided missiles, which had developed during the program. As the 275A languished, he and his design team worked on other missiles. A project to develop a more reliable seeker for the 275 led to this semi-active radar homing 277, and then a highly ambitious active version of the same thing. This is roughly the same time that active Sparrows were being investigated in the US. The active 277 then led to the 280, which used the active head to get around the range and power limitations of the so-called radar that Lavochkin thought might solve all of the Anaconda's problems. By solve, he basically wanted a missile that didn't outrange the radar. Exactly what happened to the 280 isn't clear, but it was certainly never deployed. Lavochkin and his team were also hard at work on the Storm intercontinental cruise missile and the DAL long-range surface-to-air missile. The latter in particular was much favoured by Khrushchev. With the poor performance of 3 Red in the interception trials, he advised that the K-15 project be terminated. Although Lavochkin OKB was excused from working on it, the 2 prototypes were handed over to the GCAT State Committee for Trials to assess whether there was any merit in continuing with the basic design. Their conclusion was that the extended development process had left the Anaconda and the K-15 integrated interception system already functionally obsolete. The aircraft had been designed without basic aerodynamic advances like area ruling, and the intake geometry required significant work. Even if Lolka could produce the uprated engines, its performance would remain substandard. It was also perceived to be unreliable. By the point that the state trials began in 1954, the 4 prototypes had flown only 21 times, resulting in 3 serious crashes that had written off 2 airframes and put another in a shop for a year. The radar barely worked long enough to be tested and thus was hopelessly far away from operational deployment. Although 275A missiles were now being made, and indeed over 100 would eventually be produced, beam riding was demonstrably not the future. Lavochkin's alternatives were assessed to be substandard versus proposals from other OKBs. The K-15 program was therefore officially terminated in 1960. A vague attempt was made to sanction Lavochkin, but this went nowhere, partly because a great deal of useful information and thinking had emerged from the attempt, and the man himself keeled over and died of a heart attack while watching tests at Shari-Shagan. The prototypes were given to Tupolev to help them in developing the balloon-massacring Tu-128, an aircraft that would go on to be a somewhat successful validation of the heavy interceptor and integrated weapons system concepts. For Lavochkin, the Anaconda was the last flyable aircraft it built, a sad but ambitious end to a pioneering OKB.